Hello and welcome to AXSChat. I'm delighted that you're joining us for another week, and I'm equally delighted that we're interviewing Rachele Hendricks-Sturrup today. Rachel is an academic and working for the Future of Privacy Forum, which has a really interesting role. It's a non-profit organization that is looking into things like the ethical and legal dilemmas of technology and society. So, I mean, these are big questions. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, how you came to be in this super interesting role, please.
Yes, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, as you mentioned, I work for the Future of Privacy Forum, a think tank located in Washington, D.C. There, I work as the Health Policy Counsel and lead, focusing on issues at the forefront of technology and innovation and how it affects the world of consumer health, consumer genetics, and also how that might even intersect with traditional clinical settings where health and genetics are at the forefront as well. So really broadly here in the US, and I say that because the term I'm about to use is related to the 21st Century Cures Act. Here in the US, I focus on matters related to things like precision medicine, um, mobile health, um, really the full gamut of what all of these technologies can do for health consumers and patients, and for other stakeholders like companies who create them.
Excellent. And technology is this amazing thing, and we're seeing the rapid acceleration of the deployment of technology and the deployment of ever more how do I put this, invasive in terms of knowing more about us. So the technology has so much more knowledge about us now in terms of, even sort of, it's able to predict stuff that we don't even understand about ourselves. We're taking biosignal readings. We're embedding stuff into our bodies. We're collecting all kinds of the quantified human being, through the things we're wearing on our wrists and from everything else that we're doing. How do we keep on top of all of this? Make sure that this data that we're gathering, the picture and the predictability patterns that we can create from all of this are used for the right reasons. These are the kind of ethical questions that you're pondering upon, right? That as an organization.
Absolutely. So I spend a lot of time thinking about what I think you just described as what we might call an N of one study, where a single person can generate billions of different data points about themselves and then transform into what you just called a quantified person. Um, Thinking about that, and then also thinking broadly about how data is now collected across millions in society, millions of data points about their movement, data points about their health behavior, also data about their genetics, and data about their location. All of that is sort of coming together to allow data users or processors to create segments of populations to assist them in understanding those populations and also reaching out to those populations. So, really, ourselves as individuals and then together as a society or as a population, we are becoming increasingly quantified. And today we have the infrastructure that allows that quantified person to exist, whereas we didn't have that, say, a couple of decades ago. So as we collect all of these data points and try to figure out what they can tell us when we transform them from data into evidence, what does it mean? Who's going to use the data and why? What are some of the limitations to using this data, given that the data is really just a snapshot, really just a cross section analysis of a person at a certain time under a certain environmental condition or environmental setting. How how important is it to recognize the limitations of those data sets to make sure that any choices we make down the line don't perpetuate any particular bias, any particular opinion that may be just that of what it is, an opinion and not necessarily a fact. and how do we educate society on how to ask the right questions rather than educating them about what exactly they should know, more about how should we think about this, or as we collect all of these data points, how should we partner that with more qualitative data so that way we can understand the context around the quantified data that we have collected and that we're trying to understand, to ask a sort of research question or any question that might help drive other aspects of society like the economy, healthcare, creating better standards of care, empowering the consumer, or making certain processes around healthcare or around entertainment or whatever it might be more efficient for the user. How do we ask the right questions to make sure we're helping ourselves and not hurting ourselves and others?
So I think that those are really good questions to be asking, and I think that one of the things that I've been observing is that there is an awful lot of concentration about being able to use data in certain ways, but what we're tending to do is look in a fairly siloed way at some of this stuff. So we have these great big data lakes, but we're asking questions that are quite narrow, and we're not really understanding all of the sort of sideways or systemic impacts. So I think that what we're really lacking at the moment in some of this stuff is systems thinking, because of the we're looking to solve one problem, and if all you've got is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So we're applying this sort of data analytics approach without really thinking about all of the sort of other things that we might need to consider. So when you mentioned about precision medicine, for example, everyone's going, right, this is brilliant. We can cure stuff before it starts happening. But what about the impact that's going to have on people's ability to get health insurance and healthcare and stuff like that? Are we actually then creating an underclass? Are we creating Gattaca, if you like? What about the fact that other people are going, what, we can cure ADHD, we can screen it out. Well, maybe we don't want to be screened out. Maybe that's maybe that's eugenics. So how can an organization like the Future Privacy Forum influence these conversations and get the people that are plunging headlong into developing this tech, because they're not going to slow down to actually engage and consider these questions before the genie's really out of the bottle?
That's an excellent question, and thank you for your comments. I think it really or you really drove home the point of the point that I think I'm trying to make here, which is that we have to be better data stewards. At the Future Privacy Forum, we champion ourselves as data stewards, basically helping individuals and others, other data stakeholders understand that it's not that we're trying to prevent the collection of the data in the name of privacy. It's that we're trying to imagine the future of privacy as how will the data be used and how can we educate people on using the data in ways that are good for individuals and good for society. So again, chauffeuring the data towards good applications, beneficial applications, so that way as the data is generated, processed, and used, we're collaborating around using the data, not compromising ourselves in the process or compromising the livelihood of ourselves and others for the benefit of innovation or in the name and sake of innovation or precision medicine, as you said it.
Wow, this is an amazing conversation. And I know that I had the pleasure to speak on a panel with you, Rachel, and I was just blown away. You give me a lot of hope for the future. And I wonder things like, I know that we're very concerned about the lack of data sets for diverse groups all over the world. We're very concerned about that, and we should be. And there's a lot of efforts. That's how we met. We met on Mia Dan's, which I love Mia, on the Women in AI and Ethics panel. And I see a lot of groups really struggling to make sure their data sets are appropriately included. But how do you tie all the, I mean, I love, you're teaching me data stewards and the data stakeholders. How do we make sure the right data, and I don't even know if that is the right word, is collected, and is there, how do we make sure all the groups are represented appropriately? It just sometimes feels like such a gigantic problem with so many moving parts, which I think you and Neil certainly were already exploring this morning. But I'm just curious, do you have any ideas on how we do that? Because it feels still like we're doing it siloed, very siloed and not working together.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's a very nuanced question. As you stated, representation matters. It's very important to not make material decisions based on data that lacks representation or that is biased or skewed to a particular population, yet applied to the broad population. It's important to recognize the limitations to the data, as I mentioned earlier, but also equally understand that, representation in the data is very important, especially if the use of that data set will affect the population broadly. But then at the same time, and probably on the flip side of things, you have to understand the sensitivities around who does not want to be included in the data set and why. There could be trust issues around how the data will be used, controversy around how the data will be used, a certain precedent that maybe was set by the data user or handler that has, stirred up some controversy among society, so as or leading to the effect of, individuals not feeling comfortable essentially contributing data or information about themselves. And then also data sharing practices are a concern among many individuals. Probably it's a global concern, really. Data sharing practices in the sense that if I give you my data, how can you assure me that you won't share it with another third party that may or may not have a nefarious intent around using my data, or as I've given you broad consent over uses of my data, how will I know that any secondary uses will be in my best interest, or in the best interest of society, or my immediate loved ones, or whomever. So there are a lot of unanswered questions, and we are really just at the cusp of trying to figure this out. And I think we're at a very critical moment in society where we are now understanding that it's not just the quantified individual that's important, it's about the quality of the qualified individual that's important, and really understanding again, what are some of the humanistic aspects that accompany not just the collection and generation of the data, but the uses of the data. How do we bring the human back to the center rather than just kind of taking off with this reductionist quantified person approach? And that's, I think, the greater challenge that we've now faced, or that we now face, because now it's allowing, or it's pressuring us to look at ourselves in the mirror. And unfortunately, for most, that's one of the hardest things to do. Here we are coming back full circle, looking ourselves dead in the face and asking ourselves, okay, as qualified individuals, how do we responsibly guide all of this quantitative information about ourselves to make sure that we're not harming ourselves today and generations down the line?
Thank you, Rachel. No, when I look to the world of data, with elements of using for artificial intelligence or even for industry and manufacturing, I just see so many contradictions from policymakers, from different sectors, from advocacy groups who sometimes collide in terms of interests, and then from industry or companies who are trying to. We want to use data, but somehow we are always afraid of doing a mistake because somebody is going to tell us you have done something wrong there. Just as a side note, when we were discussing GDPR in Europe, on my mind, I had decided, the first organizations that are going to be hit by GDPR is not going to be private; it's going to be government. So, because I have reasons to that, because usually in Europe, in the public sector, that's where the problems with systems exist, because they don't use updated systems. Sometimes government doesn't fund enough organizations to have access to the latest applications. So when I saw all the politicians, pushing GDPR, I was really expecting that to happen, and that's what actually happened. Public hospitals that are funded by government who use applications approved by government were the first ones to get fines for GDPR. So it's quite a contradiction, because actually government are the ones who apply those rules. So it's a kind of a contradiction on itself. And more recently, about a week ago, there was a discussion in a big event in Europe on digital between industry leaders and government. And people with the industry were saying, okay, the German government is trying to put together an application for a kind of a digital passport for COVID for 11 months. And after 11 months, you're not able to build an app, a system, because even within government, you're not able to make yourself clear in relation to the use of data. So if the regulators they are not able to come forward with a simple idea how to use data, how can we expect private companies to do it? So in the end, how can we sort out all this mess?
Yeah, no, you definitely highlighted a lot of contradictions that I think, many of us have seen. I have certainly seen. And so, another thing we do at FPF is we try to engage. Engagement is another thing that I think is incredibly important today, bringing everyone to the table to discuss exactly what you just said. People with your perspective, like, okay, I'm bringing the perspective of someone from civil society, and this is what I've observed. I've observed engagement between government and industry in this contradictory way that doesn't work. And ultimately, myself and others within civil society are the ones, or at least one of the entities that suffer in the process of it all. So obviously, guys, this is not working. So bringing voices like yours to the table with industry and government present, bringing everyone to the table so that way they're present, they have a safe space to engage, and they have someone moderating to control for any power dynamics that might exist amongst the groups, collecting information to find out first of all, what can we all agree on? We might not agree on how to get there, but what do we all agree on in terms of where we need to go and what we want and what we need to do? We're here to sort of level set and fact find around that. So that way we can figure out what everyone is saying, but not saying, or saying and not saying. A lot of times when I engage with stakeholders with multiple perspectives or lived experiences, I often find that we're all saying the same thing 5, 6, 7 different ways, or we all want the same thing, but we just simply don't agree on how to get there. So again, making sure that we have a represented group at the table, going back to what Debra mentioned, representation is key, making sure that we're not leaving critical or key stakeholders out of the conversation, and making sure that we are essentially flying the spaceship where, together, not just in an old-fashioned, power strained way that we have been, I'd say, for the last hundreds of years. So how do we not, repeat mistakes of the past in terms of leaving people behind, and rather leveraging the data that we can collect and leveraging the infrastructure that we have to collect all of the data, or leveraging the organizations that have emerged, like the Future of Privacy Forum, leveraging all of that to make sure that, again, we are moving towards a state of good versus a state of more inequality, or a state of more violence against certain groups, or a state of misunderstanding between one group and another. There's a real art to that. And that's, I think, one of the hardest things to do. It takes a lot of skill in conflict resolution and a lot of skill in engagement, essentially. And also it takes a human to know how to connect with other humans to make sure that everyone feels that they're in a safe space, a place where their opinion is valued, or their perspectives are heard, their lived experiences are actually validated and taken into account, and not dismissed because of power dynamics that might exist in the room. We need this sort of mediation down the line, especially leveraging that with data in a stewarded fashion.
One of the things that has frustrated me a little bit is that the fact that this is taking us so long, and in the end, I don't think it will be that difficult. But it's taking us so long to bring clarity in the way how we use data, and this takes away different opportunities. And in the situation that we are now, I believe this could have helped us to mitigate the spread of the pandemic if we're able to use the data in the right way. Because in the end, we haven't used the data in the right way because of privacy concerns. I think this could have been a great way for us to operate in a smarter way, in the way how we reacted to COVID.
I 100% agree. I think right now we have an opportunity to again look inward, look at ourselves and ask, where do we want to go? So, like, will we really get where we want to go, in being divided or being or by misunderstanding one another, or being dedicated to misunderstanding one another? I mean, some people are dedicated to misunderstanding certain groups. We all know that. And that's a whole different discussion. But at the same time, for those of us who have an interest in the public good, or who have an interest in the economy, or an interest in social welfare and all of these things, we have an opportunity now to not just come to the table and engage with one another, but also to look at the data that we have collected and ask, how can we use this data, and how can we make sure that the data is of sufficient quality first before using it, in ways that benefit, or in ways that could support the stewardship efforts that we're trying to engage in at the moment, to make sure that ourselves today and generations after that can benefit from what we're doing today. And we can also teach them how to properly steward data, qualitative and quantitative data, teaching them how to properly do that because we've done it already. So transferring those lessons learned today and into future generations, I think, are more important, or most important. And so today we've approached that challenge, and I think now is the time to seize the moment and really execute and teach generations how to do that as well.
I agree. And Rachel, you talked about it a little bit with Antonio, but are there lessons that that we have learned in society because of the pandemic and COVID-19 that can now be applied to the way that we are, collecting, managing, using data? I loved the point that you made about a quantifiable person. I've never heard that term. So I just thought that was fascinating. But I often see US corporations, just because I live in the US and I'm probably noticing that more, but in front of our Congress explaining how they misused our data and promising, oh no, and I don't believe anything they're saying, because I just feel they are going to continue to misuse our data. I think consumer confidence is at an all-time low, but have we as society, and through the work that you are doing, are you seeing lessons learned that are going to be valuable as we move forward?
I have seen lessons learned emerge, and it really comes from, I would say, or at least when it comes to learning how to engage individuals and bring diverse perspectives to the table, I have seen that happen, or those types of lessons learned created on the academic side. A lot of academicians have been dedicated to doing that, as well as other nonprofit organizations that have a data driven focus. And I have also seen advocacy organizations, others from civil society, like citizen scientists, for example, create these sorts of lessons learned. So even drawing on some resources that they've created that are publicly available online are a good place to start. Obviously at FPF, we've put out our own work. We continue to put out our own work on, in this regard. And we will continue to do this, especially amid COVID-19. I've spent a lot of time recently looking at vaccine passports, really understanding the nuances there. And really, I think one important thing to realize is that, as we sort of anchor our new way or desire to digitize vaccine passports or vaccine records and use them in a way that's more broad than what we're used to. It's important to understand, first of all, there are still a lot of unanswered questions around COVID in terms of, what vaccine efficacy might look like, in the next 5 years. Also, vaccine passports. We're creating this digital solution for a one-time pandemic, for for a particular cross-sectioned or cross-sectional event in time. And then on top of that, some are even considering the use of vaccine passports for day-to-day access to just day-to-day events and activities, like going to the park, going to the bank, going to the grocery, going to the doctor, whatever it might be, going to work. So do we want to really create this sort of surveillance society around, or in the name of vaccine passports, or in the name of addressing COVID-19? Vaccine records are or have been around for a long time. I mean, a lot of us are familiar with having to show them when we travel internationally or when we sign our kids up for school, when we go to school on campus. So, showing vaccine records is not new, but a vaccine passport just to gain access to day-to-day activities is a bit invasive to many. And many have argued that. And again, thinking about, whatever we do today or whatever we implement today could become the new societal norm in the future. Is that where we really want to go? And is this really in the best interest of privacy, in the best interest of societal growth, and also in the best interests of generations to come that might, fight back, against, the privacy invasive nature of any type of passport. We still just have so many questions. And I think, understanding, again, how digitization and data play a role in all of this, who's storing all of this vaccine passport data, who's storing all of the geolocation data that might accompany it, it's questionable. And we cannot just implement something without asking these questions first and engaging the right stakeholders. So that way we can sort of like vote on whether or not this is actually where we want to go or what we want to do.
Yeah, and I think that what we're seeing with COVID is we've seen very draconian laws put in place that in normal times would have people protesting in the streets at the very thought of, and yet we've allowed all of this stuff just to be applied to us, and the amount of surveillance that states can now impose on citizens is unprecedented. We have the technology to do it to a much deeper level than ever before as well. So I think that those kind of things almost have been done unquestioningly because we've sleepwalked into this because we were in this crisis. What we're seeing in the UK right now is changes to the laws about protest too. So even when COVID finishes, we're still going to be able to have difficulty being able to protest these laws, because actually there are new laws being put in place that restrict our ability to do what we've always done, which is gather in person to raise our concerns. So some of them do have a time limit on them, but essentially the precedent has now been set. The other thing is, I think that also we've really fixated on digital. And where the UK failed really miserably in terms of track and trace was that actually we trusted digital over existing systems. So actually we had a really very good paper-based system of epidemiology tracking and tracing in the UK, and it was well set up, but it was done manually by the doctors' surgeries, and they collated all of it. But we have an administration that is fixated with digitizing everything, and so they didn't consult the doctors. They didn't go to the traditional way. They went out and contracted that to organizations that had no past history in doing this stuff, and as a result, none of it worked.
Yeah.
So I think we also, in our ethical considerations, also need to be thinking about, is technology always the answer to some of this stuff? Why do we have to digitize? Because everyone's saying, yes, we must digitize. So why don't we take a step back and understand what we've got, and determine whether or not we should digitize, and what we should be doing, and like Antonio is saying, in terms of privacy, etc., which bits of information are necessary. And I know that some former colleagues of mine are working on things like blockchain, in terms of allowing only the relevant bits of information to be given to people, to enable that sort of certain transactions to take place. So you have your sort of digital identity on the blockchain, but you only share the bits that are required for that entity to deliver a service to you, etc. So I think that there are people thinking about this stuff and thinking about where it's necessary to apply tech, but that as a society we need to take stock of this and think a bit more deeply. So I'm really impressed by the work that's being done by your organization on this.
Oh, thank you. And I agree. I think a lot of confidence was placed in, efforts or digitization efforts like digital contact tracing, but we fail to first and foremost understand what society actually wanted or needed, or what society felt comfortable felt comfortable with using. A lot of the user experience, user interface sort of work, hadn't been there initially. So or if it was, it just probably or clearly just wasn't enough. So there's still a lot of questions that we need to ask. There's still a lot of introspect that we need to gain on the topic before we can move forward and just, set the train running around digitization efforts in COVID-19.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your insights today. We've reached the end of our half hour. I just need to thank Barclays Access, Microlink, and MyClearText for keeping the lights on, helping keep us going and sustaining all of the work that we've been doing for the last 7 years. And we really look forward to you joining us on Twitter next week.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great job. Great job.